million short. All right, I think we're on. All right. So I guess we will start the meeting then. We now call this meeting to order. If we could please recite the Pledge of Allegiance. Sure. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. City Clerk, if you could read the roll call.
Mayor De La Isla.
Here.
Council members Hiller.
Here.
Valdivia Acla.
Here.
Ortiz. Emerson.
Here.
Padilla.
Here.
Nager. Dobler.
Here.
Duncan.
Here.
And Lester.
Here.
All right, we now move on to the appointments, and the clerk would read.
I'm sorry, there are no appointments and no consent agenda.
Awesome, phenomenal. So at this point in time, we quickly move into the non-action items. And I just want to give a little bit of a brief background on why this is so important to us as a governing body. First, I'm sure that you can see that we are all separated from each other, and we are keeping social distancing practices. I have my sanitizer here with me as well. We're very grateful to our team that makes sure that they clean up everything because we take this virus extremely seriously. Part of the discussions that this body decided was we wanted to make sure that as a team, we all came together alongside our city manager to have a conversation with regards to our budget concerns as we move forward as a community, understanding that the COVID pandemic is not something that we'll see now, but it's something that will be here for a while. Therefore, impacting not only our revenues, but the way that we do business overall. We have requested from the city manager some information to open up the meeting with. And the format of this meeting will more than likely be pretty simple in the sense that once we start talking about the budget issues, we'll probably go around each council member so that they can start presenting some of their ideas back to the body that either they have heard from constituents or for team members, so that we can present this all to our city manager, and then continue having a conversation with regards to how will that impact the budget, and how will our budget start looking and our organization overall start looking from this point on. So without further ado, city manager, take it away.
Thank you, Mayor. So we're here because we're expecting severe reductions in our revenues funding for the city government this year. We know that the stay-at-home orders and even the reopening plan have limited business from functioning as they normally would. The actual amount of reduced revenue is predicted to be anywhere from between 10 to 30%, depending on how prolonged the economy stays in a recession mode with high unemployment. We have asked other cities what they are using for planning factors, and they're using similar numbers in the 10 to 30% range. The hard part, though, is to know exactly where we're at. We won't know that, though, until the end of June, because that's when we'll have our first April sales tax figures. Of course, each month that we have data, it allows our predictions and planning models to narrow the projection as to where we will end up by the end of the year. We will, of course, continue to update the governing body. Look at this meeting as being the first of many that we'll have as we go through this process, looking at the various information and data that's available. This is really not much different than what I usually do with staff. Staff is always looking at the forecast. How's the revenue going? We're having monthly meetings typically. So this is in line with what we typically do by the finance staff. The Finance and Administrative Services Department, with the assistance of members from the various other departments, have prepared information related to the financial status of the various funds of the city. The department has also provided 3 levels of impact scenarios related to the loss of money within each fund. The scenarios are related to whether the impact on revenues will be short-lived or much longer, lasting throughout the year. The spreadsheets will include planned actions by staff that will reduce expenditures to save money in each fund, and also talks about the amount of reserves that we would plan to see used for each fund as well. We also have information related to all but one of the internal service funds that we will review and explain their financial condition and impact by each scenario on each of them. I want to thank, first of all, the finance staff for the many extra hours that it took to get this information prepared for a presentation today. We normally would love to provide these documents to you sooner than today, but the sheer amount of work that was involved did not allow that to happen. We will go through this information, Jessica will, providing you the information, and then, of course, feel free to ask questions as you go as there's an unsure issue. The 2020 budget reduction issue will appear on more agendas in the future, including next Tuesdays, and then every 2 weeks thereafter as we provide information to keep you continually updated and allow for discussion. After Jessica has completed the presentation, we'll answer any questions and, of course, listen to comments and suggestions you have regarding reductions that we need to make within our 2020 budget. I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, City Manager.
Yeah.
So we have
Okay.
everybody now?
Mayor, would you like me to start?
Yes, there we go. Now we see you.
Okay. Thank you for taking time this afternoon. As the city manager said, the finance staff typically.
Echoing. There we go.
I turned the volume down.
I think I fixed it.
Jessica, could you try speaking again? We had you on multiple screens, therefore you had a really big echo.
Well, that's unfortunate for everybody to have me on multiple screens.
There we
so-
go, much better.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you for having us in this afternoon. The financial projection update is a standard procedure for us. The request on Tuesday to have the meeting today definitely put us into high gear so that we could provide some additional information. Typically, we would be looking at this type of projection run at the end of a month, just so that we capture the last several days of the month. So as you'll see, the projection numbers run through the beginning of this week, and then we will update them again. What the city manager has asked for me to do is to update you on what we're looking at in the general fund in terms of revenue, in the motor fuel fund, the internal service funds, facilities, fleet, and IT. There's also risk management fund, which we will not be providing an update on today. We can do that at a later date. Its impact from COVID-19 is slightly different. We will also be providing an update on parking, and then also the 3 utilities. So, I think the big differences that we're seeing, and I'm sure you've noticed, is that we're just getting more information. So we've received another sales tax check. Unfortunately, that only reflects February, so that doesn't give us a lot of insight into the current environment. We've received additional insight into what the state received in March, and that's detailed in the memo. I would assume that we would see somewhat similar activity in March. We've also received just additional revenue receipts from a variety of items, since it's been about 4 weeks since we updated. And some of the other larger items in the general fund, the police department was awarded a DOJ grant that will help us respond. The state of Kansas has put out the application process to try to access some of the CARES Act, the second CARES Act, that they will distribute to municipalities. We've gotten more insight from the federal government, and the expectation is that over the next several weeks that we should see another stimulus package. And my understanding is that there's a variety of officials that are advocating for local governments and states. So currently our expectation is that we would receive some funding potentially from the next CARES Act that would hopefully be able to offset some of the revenue loss and not just looking at expenses. I want to just highlight that this overall forecast, especially with the timeliness of it, would not have been possible given our limited staff in the finance department if it wasn't for many people over at Public Works. Hannah, Brian, Dan, Jackie, thank you so much for giving over your time this week. Sherry and Mark in IT were really helpful. Jason was as well in Public Works. The utility department, Nicole and I spent several late nights going back and forth on some of their projections, and obviously Bob and Braxton have been super helpful this week. And then outside of the production for this Friday, you know, we've over the last 2 to 3 weeks been having meetings with every department. And so I just want to thank each department head for trying to provide ideas on savings that would limit the operational impact to the city's operations. You know, we've had productive meetings with both police and fire, and they've provided ideas that they would be comfortable with as the year goes on, potentially enacting. We're still looking through them in terms of feasibility, and at a future date, we would be able to have either fire or police, depending on the department, speak to those recommendations. So I think without further ado, we'll get right into the memo. So what I was planning to do today is just kind of walk through the different spreadsheets and the memo, and if you have questions as we go along, I'd be happy to try to answer them. Otherwise, you know, we can always get back to you. So the city manager asked me to walk through the memo rather than a presentation, and then at the end of the memo discussion, I believe the city manager will take over and field some additional questions. So let me see if I can share my screen. Okay. So what you see in front of you is the general fund. Now, what I think you might find particularly interesting is that the general fund revenue projection has changed some. Unfortunately, I don't think it's improved significantly. We will, for ad valorem taxes, that has changed for the better. That really just reflects we got a higher than normal payment in March for property taxes. Now, that is not one of our big months, so that could also just be an anomaly. But that has improved in terms of what we're thinking for year end. You still see that in the high impact scenario, we would expect not meeting the budget. But that really would be in the event, you know, people wouldn't be able to pay their property tax. And the deadline is May 10th. So we will have a better insight into that number in June when we actually get the distribution. Motor vehicle, AV, we're still expecting to hit budget. Sales tax is one of the harder items to really look at and provide guidance on. We've looked through several models in terms of what kind of cut or reduction we're expecting. We've reached out, the city manager reached out to Freddie over at Topeka, and he provided some thoughts and insight into, absent a safer at home order, what a deficit would look like if we mimicked the declines we saw in the Great Recession. We are kind of in the middle when it comes to other municipalities and what they are currently projecting. Some communities in the Johnson County area are really looking at somewhere between 10 and 30%, with many of the communities more dependent on sales tax looking closer to 20%. So this is one of those where we are separating into 4 buckets. The collections we've already had, what the different scenarios in April could potentially be. As we've communicated in the past, the city receives about 60% of their annual sales tax from retail, and then another about 11%, I believe, from food service. So with both of those sectors being significantly impacted by the safer at home order, it's making it a bit challenging to really assess what activity has occurred in April. The big change there is that with the safer at home order being lifted in early May, we've been able to revise our expectations so that it's not as much of a cut. But quite frankly, I think for the sales tax and many of the other revenue sources, what it comes down to is going to be how early citizens feel comfortable going back into the market. And then also if or when we see another safer at home order. What that impact would do in terms of our sales. The March numbers for the state, they did see on sales tax almost a 2% growth. And then they actually saw close to over their receipts last year and a little over an 8% growth on their compensating use tax. So that those growth factors are included for the month of March in our assumptions for us as well. Unfortunately, compensating use tax does not make up a significant portion of our overall collections. So that 8% doesn't help us a great deal, but we will continue to evaluate the different scenarios. Pilots, the biggest change here is in that high impact scenario. The previous memo didn't carry through a formula, so we've revised that down in the high impact scenario. Again, we will get additional information as the year goes on. Franchise fees is another one that we struggle with in a normal year, quite frankly, in making sure that we can hit budget or budget appropriately. As Councilman Emerson noted, the memo does indicate that our most recent check or month, we're actually down considerably, about 70%, mainly driven by two particular sectors. So we're hoping that's a timing issue because we did pull the report a week earlier than what we would have last year. So we will run it again this coming week on franchise fees. And then if it doesn't look like it's a timing issue for April, we'll reach out to the various utilities and get an update on their revenue projections and just see, what their thoughts are on that type of decline. There hasn't been a great deal of change in license and permits or intergovernmental. We won't have a good idea on the intergovernmental, which is that liquor tax, until June. So we will be looking at updating that in about 4 to 6 weeks for y'all. Municipal court hasn't changed significantly. It's still a matter of the revenue that we would have been generated mainly from police activity in the last part of March and then in April. Whether that will come in later in the year as municipal court opens up. We're trying to understand the relationship between those two items. That is the biggest changes in the revenue forecast. We're still projecting a fairly significant revenue loss, about 5.5% in the low impact scenario, 10% in the moderate, and then 16.5% in the high impact. And what's difficult about projecting revenue for the general fund, sorry, my dog is barking. What's difficult about this in the general fund is we haven't had this situation before. So in the event we went into a safer at home order in 2021, 2022, hopefully not, but if we had a similar situation, we would have a base case. And so as June rolls by, we will get through that and develop some sort of feedback to provide guidance for the end of the year. Are there any questions on revenue before I move on into expenditures?
Any questions with regards to the revenues? Seeing none, you can proceed to the expenses. Thank you.
Okay. So under the expenditure line, we haven't taken any expenditures down at this point. It's just not enough time has gone by from the beginning of our venture into Safer at Home to now. We continue to look at achieving our vacancy credit target. We will be able to provide an update in May on what that looks like. And then in terms of the other reduction items that we've previously discussed, we have taken out the personnel reduction. And so you can see in the adopted budget column, these are our target reductions. We have reached out to all departments on conference and travel, education and dues, office supplies, and consumable items. And so we are working with each department to have them meet their individual targets. For some departments, that's going to be more challenging than others, which is why in several of those lines, we don't show that we're able to meet the target completely. But we're working through it, and we hope to have more information by the end of May on that. And then just those other items, the big ones, health holiday. I know that Jackie and her team had a discussion at the health meeting, and so we'll be able to provide updates on our ability to implement that later in the year. We still believe that the health fund can absorb what is currently projected. So then looking at year end, the 2019 projected fund balance is going to be at 20.3 million. And as it's mentioned in the memo, that reflects, we have a new auditing team and they have a different take on a certain receivable. So we're going to take that off our books and it'll reduce our fund balance by about 1.29 million. So if you're using that as your base in terms of fund balance, what's available in the low impact scenario, we would be at 18.8% at the end of the year, the medium impact or moderate at 14.7%, and then the high impact at 8.1%. I just want to highlight again, part of the reason that we are able to manage the current crisis is because over the last 7 years, the city council has been committed to financial stability and putting money away. And so it definitely is an opportunity to use some of those reserves that we've set aside for a crisis. And I just want to reiterate that we don't know when the crisis is going to be over. We don't know what it's going to look like for the next 8 to 9 months. And we may frankly have another safer at home order or something even larger come into play over the next 8 to 9 months where we would need to draw on reserves even more. So that's what we're trying to manage in terms of the overall projection and year end of what amount of reserves we would use versus expenditure reductions. Is there any questions on the general fund or would you like me to move on?
Any questions? Councilwoman Heller?
Thank you, Mayor. The issue of vacancy credits and personnel expenses, I see that you did adjust this budget to reflect the vacancy credit in the adopted budget. At least I assume that's what the budget deficit is in the adopted budget column. I'm trying to figure out how all this works in the personnel services above that. We have budgeted for 77.6 million, and then there's a drop of 400,000 in the low impact, moderate, and high impact, and then correspondingly right below that on contractual services, it goes up 400,000 for each of the models. Could you talk then about the comparison between the personnel, the changes in personnel and contractual, and whether they're related, and then how we're doing on vacancy credits and whether you all really feel like we meet them?
Sure. So the budgeted number, that 77.6, is the full budgeted headcount for the city. The vacancy credit in our budget software is a negative entry. So in order to meet budget, that 77.6 million, you'd have to reduce it by 1.5 million, which is why you see that deficit in the adopted budget column.
Right. But then reading across, we go down 400,000 just in the personnel line. And then we have this additional 1.5 million in vacancy credit wherever it fits, but in the bottom at this point. How does that all work?
Well, in the personnel services line, that's number again is updated. It's impacted by all personnel costs. So if you want the breakdown of that 400,000, I can get back to you. In terms of contractual services, we had the insurance premium go up for 2020. At the beginning of this year, we were notified, so that reflects the allocation to the general fund. And in terms of our ability to meet the $1.5 million target, again, I haven't completed that analysis, so we can get back to you if that's okay.
Okay, thank you.
Additional questions for Jessica on the expenses?
Okay.
You may proceed, Jessica.
Okay, thank you. So our next fund that I've been asked to update the body on is the Special Highway Fund. So the vast majority of this fund is funded through motor fuel tax. We have received to date 1 quarter payment. We won't receive the second quarter until June. So I don't have a great update for you in terms of what that performance will look like. I haven't been guided by the state in terms of what they're seeing. I've heard anecdotally that the toll booths have seen like a 60% drop in the last month. I haven't confirmed that, so I didn't integrate that into the model. But and then the inmate program is also held in this fund. So what you're seeing here is just a base assumption for potential scenarios. And I'm just opening up the memo so that I can follow along with everybody as well. But I think what I found interesting, so the low impact scenario assumes a 15% decline, moderate impact, a 20% decline, and then a high impact, a 25% decline. The decline that we experienced after 2010 and the Great Recession was larger than, I believe, the low and moderate, but I don't necessarily think there's a correlation between that period and this period. There's fuel efficiency, other items in play. So we will update you on the revenues. I think if we hear more from the state on what they're collecting, or when we receive that June payment, that will reflect the second quarter of collections. But what we see here is that the fund is able to absorb even that high impact scenario with just really the vacancy savings. I believe there are, I want to say, 2 open positions that we will keep open until we have a better feel of what the revenue numbers look like. Like most of our other funds, 10%, I believe, is the target fund balance here. So I think we're still in a good position. The team that manages this fund on a day-to-day basis are on top of it in terms of their overall costs. So any large purchases, we're asking their management teams to really assess whether it's necessary, can it wait, and then also look to see what other items could be cut. This fund is, I won't say unique because there's other funds like it, but obviously there's a lot of personnel service costs. And then due to the work that they do, a lot of the actual funding lines, whether that's contractual services or commodities, capital, it's required that they have the resources available to actually do their job. It's, if you're working on the road, you can't use half of what you normally would to fix the road unless you're gonna pull back on the larger projects. And my understanding, based on talking with Public Works, is at this point, they're not pulling back on target on their overall projects. And we could, throughout the year, if we saw a significant decline, start to implement a reduction of projects. Any questions?
Deputy Mayor has a question.
Okay.
Yeah, Mrs. Lemondor, first of all, thank you. I know there's a lot of information you guys put together for us here in just a few days, so I really appreciate it. I think we all really appreciate everything you guys are doing. On that, I see on the bottom there, I guess reserves. Does this fund by itself have separate reserves than the city reserves? Is that correct?
Yes, it's a dedicated revenue source. We wouldn't be able to use it in the general fund. I would have to look into what laws govern.
I guess I just want to be clear, though, that this is totally separate. So if this spins into a deficit, it has reserves by itself that will cover that, correct?
Yes.
Okay. My second question would be, the special highway, or this motor fuel tax, is it a set tax per gallon, or is it a percentage? Do you know that?
Oh, goodness. Councilman Emerson, you are testing me today. I don't remember off the top of my head. I'm sorry. I can get back to you.
I think the city manager believes it's, well, here he comes.
It is per gallon.
It's a set price,
Right,
okay.
it's per gallon, which is a better way to go relative.
Yes, it is. Yeah, we'd be really hurting if it was a percent right now. Okay. Okay, thank you.
Councilwoman Hiller.
A question that I probably should already understand, but about the inmate program, we get money from motor fuel specifically for inmate program?
No, it's not. I believe in 2013, there was a decision made that to just reflect that program within this fund. I don't know if the city manager has additional information he'd like to share.
Yeah, city manager is indicating no right now.
Okay. Councilwoman, we can get back to you, but no, the actual motor fuel revenue that we get from the state and then I believe from the county is not spent on inmate crews.
Maybe we can just double check that whole thing, because this is totally motor fuels, and it has 388,000 spent on inmate crews.
Sure. The second line under their revenues is inmate program. And so that is separate from the first line, which is the intergovernmental, but absolutely, I will double check and get back to you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councilwoman Valdivia Alcala?
Thanks, Mayor. I'm just trying to clarify as I go through all of this, just what, the question that Councilwoman Hiller asked, the inmate program, 388,000 plus, it doesn't come out of the motor fuel money, correct? That's right? That's what you just said?
Is Sasha in the audience?
No.
No.
She might be on. I think she was online.
Okay. I'm just checking with Sasha because I know that she would have the answer for you.
I can't tell you.
Yeah, good afternoon, Mr. City Manager, governing body members. So the motor fuel fees that are reflected as part of that inmate program, the street department utilizes some of their motor fuel fees to pay for the contract for the inmate labor as well as the supplies for that crew. So it's not a revenue that we receive specifically for the inmate crews. That's what the department has chosen to utilize a portion of it for.
Thank you. That's helpful.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you, Sasha. Is there any other questions surrounding the inmate program? Obviously, I'm not the.
Councilwoman Ortiz?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. So is Sasha just saying funds are just in that fund? Inmate crew funds are just in that fund? Is that what we're saying? That's where we put it?
Sasha, are you still on?
Yeah, I'm still here. So, trying to see the page, I'm sorry, it's really small and I should have brought my readers.
All right.
What, are you guys on, can you, oh, special highway, never mind, I've got it.
Because what I understand Jessica to say is the highway fuel fund, the inmate is also in this fund too. That's the notes I took, and I just don't understand why we have it there. I think that's my question.
Councilwoman, I think, this is Jessica, I think I was wrong.
Well, looking at this, yeah, we should talk together, Jessica and I, and then follow up with you guys to avoid any further confusion.
Okay, that'll be great. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Madam Mayor.
Any other questions? City manager?
One thing, a couple of our crews are totally totally dedicated to the efforts along the roadways of the highway. And so it could be that this identifies those crews that only work along the highways. And I think that's what it really represents, rather than our other inmate crews that we have doing blight and that kind of an effort. So I think it's a purpose to split it out between the two, but we'll confirm that and get back to you.
Additional questions or comments? Seeing none, you may proceed, Ms. Lamandola.
Okay. So we are going to now go into the internal service fees funds. And so internal service funds are really used to account for programs that provide services to other departments and other parts of the city organization. And then based on various allocation methods, depending on the internal service fund, it gets apportioned back out to the departments throughout the city. So for instance, fleet, the fleet fund apportions out the costs of their fund based on the prior year's labor hours that were spent on each department's vehicles, and then that gets divided out. So you will see that Special Highway Fund, Fire, and PD account for a significant portion of that overall allocation. But as you can imagine, the work that they do requires additional equipment and and vehicles versus like a finance department. We just don't have that type of equipment. So in this fund, what we are looking for is the overall potential revenue impact if the general fund were to withhold a portion of their internal service fees. So in the first scenario, the general fund would withhold 3 months. In the moderate scenario, 9 months. And in the high impact scenario, it would be 9 months from the general fund and then 3 months from another fund, such as potentially like the utility or some other separate entity. Again, this fund has a fund balance that it can absorb the potential impact from the general fund. Obviously, and we'll go through this with almost every other fund, any reduce in funding impacts their core mission in the long run. So for fleet, that could impact their ability to replace vehicles or to do other capital improvements. And so we're trying to balance maintaining the general fund liquidity and ability to respond to crisis across the organization against, in the short term, against the long-term impact on these individual internal service funds. And so what this shows us is that they can absorb it. We will decide at a later date would be the recommendation at what level we need to rely on these internal service funds to balance or help the general fund maintain some balance while it also uses reserves. Any questions?
Yes, Deputy Mayor.
Thank you, Mayor. Yes, on the top line, you have fleet fees, and I understand, I see from the previous page, that's what the various departments pay them for the work. I take it, does the 900,000, does that come from the general fund, is like a transfer from the general fund?
Is Public Works on? I think that Jason O'Brien would be best suited to answer that question.
Yeah, Jason Peak here. So, Deputy Mayor, the 900,000 represents starting what we call the fleet replacement program, and that's where there was excess funds from the general fund as well as part of the reserve fund coupled together to start the fleet replacement fund. The idea behind that capital reserve is we started as a pilot program. We reached out to different departments and basically said, here's the future replacement cost of your vehicle or equipment. If you're willing to contribute out of your operating budget, we'll use this capital budget to pay for that cost of replacing the vehicle. And so that was the budget for this year from the fleet fund.
Dr. Peak, I'm sorry, I couldn't understand a lot of that. I did hear you say it's a fleet replacement reserve, but I couldn't, sorry, all the rest of that I couldn't really understand.
Sorry, I guess get closer to the microphone here. Can you hear me better now?
Yes, I can. Yes, we can.
Yeah. So the fleet replacement fund was started as part of last year's budget cycle. And basically there was money provided from the reserves within this internal service fund, as well as some surplus general fund money. I believe it was budget year 2017. The principle behind the fleet replacement fund is it's the best practice. You set out that each department is budgeting through their operating budget what that amortized replacement cost is. They pay into this fund, and then this capital basically holds that cash to actually purchase with cash the replacement of those vehicles, and you maintain a balance to kind of smooth out that expense. Some years you're spending more, some less, depending on the makeup and life cycle of the vehicles and equipment.
Okay, thank you. I guess a question then, does the 900,000 then, does that also get applied kind of like prorated, how each much department uses? Is that where it comes from? The departments pay that 900,000?
No, sir. So the way we started this, since we didn't have budget to do it citywide, we said we have this much capital available, which departments would be willing to put their vehicles in this fleet replacement fund. And so the share each department pays in is basically the number of vehicles and the types they have in. So if you just have a sedan, you have a relatively low cost, but Public Works has some street sweepers and other pieces in there that of course have a larger annual payment cost into the fund.
Okay, thank you.
And I'll just say that as I'm looking at this is almost low-hanging fruit. It's almost going back to the whole conversation as we're looking at this fund. This is one of those that we could really just maximize efficiencies, even if it's for a year. If we have to make a pause on our purchases and extend the use of some of the things that we have in the city, maybe for a year or even two, I think that when you weigh that against looking at the amount of money that we're going to be losing, this would be an extremely justifiable place to cut. Councilwoman Hiller.
This may just be a learning question for me, but I really appreciate overall the thoroughness of all of this. We've been talking about the motor fuel fund or the special highway fund, and then over here, so on page 6 we had that chart, and then on page 8 there's a chart that shows 590,000 coming across from the special highway fund to the fleet budget fund. Where is that coming from on the expenses on the fleet fund chart?
Councilwoman, can you go through your list of documents again?
You have a chart on page 6 that we were just talking about that is the budget spread for the special highway fund or the motor fuel fund. And then 2 pages later, we have the little chart for the fleet cost allocation. And that one, the very first entry is 590,000 from the special highway fund. And I was just wondering which line items from page 6 that money comes from.
I would have to dive into the larger report. It would either be contractual services or commodities.
Okay. So it's not capital, it's just because this is just maintenance?
Right.
Thank you.
All right, you may proceed, Ms. Lamandola.
Okay. Okay, so moving into facilities, similar situation in terms of it provides services across the city. And so it's also an internal service fund, which just means that the cost of running facilities, division, department is paid for by every other department or division in the city, depending on your square footage and then the work orders from the prior year. So those departments that just have a bigger footprint are going to have a bigger allocation because it's a bigger area for facilities to maintain. This is a standard allocation method. This is not unique to Topeka. But that kind of, I'm hoping that gives you some insight into the calculation. And then in terms of the overall budget, again, we've modeled several scenarios, and this fund is a little different than the fleet fund in that its fund balance is a bit lower, so there's less for the general fund to utilize in the event it needs that flexibility. But the several scenarios include the low impact, that no payments are withheld from this fund. The moderate impact scenario assumes the general fund withholds 1 month, which is about 108,000, and then the high impact scenario would be 1.5 months of payment. I think to get to the high impact scenario, the general fund would have to be under significant stress. Because that pulls us pretty close to the fund balance reserve minimum, but it also would put the fleet fund in a position that they may not be able to respond to a significant issue in one of the buildings. And as we all know, most of our buildings are quite old, and from HVAC to roof to asbestos, whatever it may be, we need that flexibility within the facilities fund to address those issues. They have identified vacancy savings, I believe, from one headcount at approximately 42,000, and then they are going to be looking at their contractual and commodity lines to try to achieve about almost a $31,000 reduction.
Questions, comments? Jessica, you may proceed.
Okay. So moving on into IT. This is a fund that we all benefit from. I know that in this different working environment, I have greatly appreciated the assistance from the staff in the IT department, helping get the vast majority of my department working remotely and having computers that are working and other resources. So I just wanted to, have an opportunity to thank them. So thank you, IT. And so in terms of looking at their budget, the allocation method here is a combination of full-time employees in your department, telephones, and then computers. Again, it's a standard allocation method for IT departments. The police department, by far, as you can see, has the largest portion of it, but they also have the most people and devices. So that would be that allocation there. And then in terms of their budget, we do have some flexibility here in the event the general fund had to rely on these other internal service funds to maintain liquidity within the general fund. The low impact scenario assumes 1 month of the general fund withholding payment, the moderate 2 months, and then the high impact withholding 3 months. And so you can see from the chart that even in the high impact scenario, the IT fund would still maintain reserves that they could potentially use to address capital needs and or, if we had a cybersecurity issue or something that popped up. The hesitant part of a finance director, recognizing the long-term goals that we're all trying to meet, any resource we pull from these internal service funds limits their ability to deliver the service that they've been tasked with. So with that, that's kind of the rundown with IT. Any questions?
Nope, don't see any. You may proceed.
Ortiz. Mayor, Councilwoman Ortiz.
Oh, Councilwoman Ortiz has a question. Pardon me, Councilwoman.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Jessica, when I look at the IT fee allocation, the mayor has 7,515. We have 6,000. Why is the mayor so high?
I had the same question.
And not picking on the mayor, I'm just saying, it just seems like there's just one person in there.
Two.
I guess I would have to go back and look at the allocation.
Thank you for asking that question, Councilwoman, because I was figuring the same thing. But
And can I ask another question, please?
yes, ma'am.
Thank you. The miscellaneous grants, what is that?
Hello.
Couldn't hear you.
She's frozen.
Is she?
I think she is.
I think she was asking what.
She's very good.
think she was asking what the miscellaneous grant was.
Yes, what does that entail?
Let me look at that department code. I'll get back to you. I don't know the $9,000 number there.
Okay, and my next question,
Okay.
on executive, does that fall under the city manager?
Yes.
Yes.
And then under grants, what does that entail? Thank you.
Okay, the grants is the same miscellaneous grants, is that right? Or is there, oh, okay, the other grants. Okay. I'll get back to you. I can look at the project codes. It'll be a quick response.
I just thought the mayor had some super duper phone or something.
I wish.
Maybe. Yeah, I don't know. I'll have to look into it for you.
Thank you.
Uh-huh.
Maybe the deputy mayor's got the super duper phone. Heck, he's cutting everything.
Okay, so from this section, we'll look into the mayor miscellaneous grants and grants allocation method.
Thank you.
Okay. Uh-huh. All right, if there's no additional questions, we'll move on into the enterprise funds. Okay, so then looking at our first enterprise fund, parking. This one is, at least to me, it's a little more interesting when it comes to developing a forecast, because it's dependent upon economic activity and overall activity downtown. So what we'll see here is, as an enterprise fund, they don't rely on the general fund. It is a separate fund. So the revenue that comes into that fund is from a fixture, and then it stays within that fund. So this is not one of those places where we would, the general fund would be looking to potentially, withhold payment or something. This is separate and distinct from an internal service fund. So in the parking fund, what we've done here is we have the adopted budget, and then we developed several scenarios. The scenarios include, in the low impact, to date through March, you would have your normal already collected, it's already in the books, and then no collection in April, May, and June for enforcement, and then return to normal activity in July, and then throughout the rest of the year. The moderate impact scenarios includes the January through March collections that have already been collected, no collection in April, May, and June, and then 50% of normal collections starting in July. And then the high impact scenario, no collection or normal collections, January, February, and March, no collection in April and May, and then the revenue collection returns to 25% in June through August, and then 50% of collection from September to December. We discussed this at our last meeting. The current scenario that we have out is that we are not collecting for April and May, so that's out there. And so each month that we don't enforce or collect is about $250,000. So with those 2 months, this fund will lose about $500,000 down for this parking fund. And you can see from the fund balance that it can absorb it, but as the discussions we've had as a group over the last year have really focused on the infrastructure for this fund, that does limit our ability in the long run to be able to address infrastructure. And so there's one line that's unique to this forecast. It's that bottom line. It's that system deferred maintenance cost. So at the bottom, that includes the 2005 report and then the additional, I believe that was calculated in 2016. And so that's just to highlight that the reason this fund has this type of fund balance is that it is enclosed, the revenue comes in, stays there, and then from that revenue, they have to also invest in the infrastructure. And like many of the city's assets, they would benefit from some improvements. So that's the biggest, I think, discussion item in parking is we know what we've lost in April, and we can calculate May based on April. Almost 90% of the parking revenue comes from the fees directly with the garages. And so, this fund will be watching, and if we see additional activity downtown, and then going back to potentially lifting restrictions in June, and hopefully people feel comfortable getting back into the community and we start to see more activity.
Deputy City Manager, Deputy Mayor, to be followed by Councilman Duncan.
Thank you, Mayor. Ms. Lavendola, and I'm sorry if this is somewhere in there. I did not get read this far yet. But the second item on the revenue from that is municipal court and other, and it's 202,000, but through all the scenarios, it's 53. I mean, it's basically a quarter of what was budgeted. Can you explain that, please?
I can. It's Jason, please jump in. So this is the enforcement downtown. And so there hasn't been a decision that I know of that has been made in terms of to go back to enforcement or not. This is just one of the more conservative approaches that we are trying to stress the system to see what it looks like if we didn't go back to normal enforcement activity.
So that then would be, so far this year, we brought in 53,295 to date, and this would be no more enforcement for the rest of the year. Is that correct?
I can get back to you. That would be my assumption, but I'd have to double check.
Okay, thank you.
Deputy Mayor, that is correct. We brought in approximately 53,000 in fines to date. And so under this model, and that's one of the things we're talking with city manager about, is do we resume that enforcement knowing there's been economic impact? So we just kind of made that assumption to give you an insight into what could happen with the fund if we made that decision.
Okay, thank you.
Councilman Duncan.
Well, that touched on one of my questions, was if we've had discussions about timelines for when enforcement might start, because that obviously gives us some guidance. And obviously, I don't know, I assume that also means the garages. We don't have any timeline for when we want to reopen. Are we thinking of reopening garages now that, at least assuming I don't know what Shawnee County is going to say at 4 o'clock, but if they're in line with what the governor has done, retail will open again. So have we thought it'd be at least about opening garages June 1st or even sooner?
We will wait until later in the month to make a final decision, but if things track as we're expecting, my plan would be to open in June. That we would, the garages, people will be coming back to work downtown. May not be everyone, and we'll work with those individuals that maybe are going to work from home from now on, since they did it for a while, and look at the leases if they want to keep them, if they don't, and then also the enforcement. If all the state workers, everybody's back in the downtown area working, then we need to go back to enforcement in order to make sure that people are moving so our retailers can actually take advantage of them being able to park close to their retail spot. So enforcement, charging daily fees for parking in garages will likely start again in June, but we're not sure.
I mean, one of my suggestions would be, if nothing else, in June, and I think I've read support, we probably have some businesses who have leases who, not that they don't want to save $1 right now, but might be willing to pay those leases versus others who might have true hardships. I would at least suggest, if we're thinking of just not collecting, we at least would ask people to ask for a waiver to provide us a reason why they can't pay those leases, because some of those people I know, having talked to 2 of those businesses, will start paying their bill again when that time comes. So they're willing to help the city and pay that revenue. So What are we doing with current employees who were downtown parking employees?
Well, Jason, you want to cover it? I mean, you developed a plan and how you're using them. I know it, but I'll let you cover it.
Sure, City Manager. So Councilman, the current, we do have vacancies within the current parking staff. Like the week prior to this pandemic starting, we finally filled our PCO, which are the enforcement officer positions, and that had been vacant for a while. So for the first several weeks, we had them training their routes, getting familiar with the process. So that was training. In the interim, since we're not doing enforcement, we've had them assist garage staff with some garage maintenance and cleaning of the garages. We're also moving forward with the Passport, which is the online parking system that's going to help with our permits, as well as mobile pay. And so staff are kind of working on that implementation piece as well.
So not to be that guy, but if we decide that we're not going to continue enforcement for 3 to 4 months, are we going to reach a point where we need to look at whether there's a furlough or something with those individuals if there's not actual work for them to be doing?
Yes.
Sure. I think that's a great question to look at, Councilman. I mean, basically the monthly impact of those enforcement salaries is a little under $30,000 a month. So in the overall scheme of the fund, and then just the time to train and get new staff on board now that we've got them, I think those are the factors we want to look at before making that decision.
And then last thing, piggyback off what Councilmember Emerson asked too, as it relates to our, I guess he was asking about municipal court fees, right? Okay, I'll ask this one later then, never mind.
And I appreciate those comments because I think that one of the things that we have been discussing is savings to the city so that we can sustain operations of our organization while still reducing our expenses. But I think that the other thing that we have to be talking about in this conversation is how do we partner with our local businesses to help them come back into the economy without addressing and putting on them an additional burden. And I know that this is one of the easy funds that we can be talking about how we do this. So I think that as we proceed in discussions on our overall budget, I think that there also has to be some sort of reopening strategy in which we include our businesses and talk about what are the things that they would need in order for them to be able to gain some traction as they are reopening in our community so that we can be supportive as well. So this is not just a city benefit discussion, it's an overall city benefit discussion. So Councilwoman Hiller.
Thank you, Mayor. Just wanted to double check. I think all of us on the council have seen that 10-year spread for the parking fund, at which point it goes bankrupt in about 4 years with to the tune of just being like $300 and some thousand in the hole. So if we're really going to challenge it with $500,000 right now, that is very significant. And everything that was in that parking plan had to do with supporting the businesses that are downtown and providing the amenities and parking and enforcement that they need. And so I want to be real careful about this one nonetheless. If I can double check, the budget for this, we were also on deck to do some increased rates to begin working progressively on that plan even this year. But the budget that we're talking about here does not have any of those increases in it, or does it?
It does not assume a rate increase that hasn't been approved.
I thought so. Thank you.
Okay, additional questions? I want to make sure I look at the screen to look at the other council members. Seeing none, Ms. Lamendola, you may proceed.
Okay, so I think we're in the home stretch. Looking, our next stop in the enterprise funds is going to be looking at the utility fund. And with this fund, again, it's if you're interested in forecasting, it's definitely the fund that is one of those interesting things to do. And I think just to start off with, much like a normal year, the utility staff tracks their revenues and expenditures very closely. They have a robust operation in terms of regular revenue and expenditure updates, forecasting usage, forecasting their capital plans. And so, although what we've provided is a low, moderate, and high impact scenarios, I just want to reemphasize that the utilities team is continuing to work on developing whatever plans necessary to ensure that coverage levels for our bond covenants are maintained, and then also that our capital plans, as much as possible, can continue forward. I mean, we've been planning and, trying to address the assets in the utility fund. And so I think just want to reemphasize that the utility fund will continue to be able to provide essential services, and that the scenarios are really as a way for to provide counsel with what potentially could happen. But my expectation is that the utility fund management is going to manage to ensure that they are able to maintain bond covenants and to address capital while delivering essential services. So for any investors out there, we're going to maintain our bond covenants. Okay, so then the first slide that you're going to be able to see, I guess before we jump into the Excel file, what I've heard back from a variety of council members is just wanting additional insight into the overall operations and not just the spreadsheets. So in the memo that you all have, one of the big unknown is the impact from the moratorium. So that was put in place on March 16th, which essentially stopped the utility system from implementing any shutoffs for non-payment. So a utility bill is due 20 days after the bill date, and then the delinquent bills are defined by having a bill past date of 21 plus days. The moratorium impact so far looks like the system has about, as of 3/16, had about $1.3 million worth of delinquent accounts, and as of April 27th, about almost $1.5 million of delinquent account balance. So that's a 15.7% increase. So we are seeing some delinquencies increase. They're still reaching out to those customers that are delinquent. I believe the message, though, has changed. It's just reminding them that they have a delinquent balance, rather than in normal times. It also says that you're at risk for being shut off. In terms of another way that they're looking at trying to assess the overall system is those outbound dialer calls and what the quantity is, and they're made based on the delinquent days. From March 15th to April 28th in 2019, 2,807 calls were made. Over that same time period this year, 4,692 calls were made. So that's a 67% increase. So again, we're seeing the purpose of the moratorium is in such a crisis to be able to provide a service, continue to provide service for customers. The system is doing that. And so from a larger financial standpoint, the question is, what is that long-term impact? And until we are out of the current crisis and back to a little bit more normal activity, I don't think we'll have a great feel for that. And whether those delinquent accounts become current once people are back at work and other things, or whether they remain delinquent and the customers are challenged to make those payments. So that's something, just an insight into the overall system in the last couple weeks. And then in terms of a potential revenue indicator would be water consumption. And my understanding is that the utilities department uses water consumption as a good indicator across all three utilities. So I don't want to just read the memo to you, but April consumption year over year has seen a decline. It's about 11.2% decline. And I don't think we don't have a good explanation of why we're seeing that decline. I know that Nicole in Utilities is continuing to look into that, so we should be able to provide more information over the next couple weeks. And then in terms of cash receipts, we have seen an increase to date in April of about 1.24% just for April. But just as a reminder, we should be seeing at least a 5% increase if all activity was the same as last year because of that rate increase. So again, we are seeing a slowdown on cash receipts, and I think we will need to look over a few more months to determine what that longer term, medium term impact is on the system. Okay, so then if you want to look, we've provided a combined utility, and this is how we would present it to outside investors and other members of the community. But in terms of maintenance, the system is maintained separately. So I'd like to just go ahead and jump into water, if that's okay with everybody.
Jessica, we have a question from Councilman Dobler.
Okay.
Thank you, Mayor. I've kind of lost track. What are the other private utilities doing right now as far as moratoriums? Does anybody know?
Same thing.
Same thing.
Same thing. I think that right now, under the governor's order, all utilities and anybody that's under the KCC has a moratorium in place. I don't know with regards to the reopening if there is going to be an extension of that order, but everybody is under moratorium.
Yeah, currently until May 31.
So I'm assuming we'll follow along
We have.
with that order and the rest of
We
you.
issued a press release yesterday saying that we were going to match, we were going to do that. And so
Okay.
we've extended till May 31, and we'll see what happens with it going forward.
Okay, one more question if I could. Water consumption, so Goodyear, I believe, is still shut down. I believe Goodyear's a huge consumer of water. I imagine there's a couple other industries. Do we assume that as soon as the industries start back up, water consumption is going to be back to normal or pretty close?
I would have to ask the utility guys as to where they see, which customers they have that are not pulling for sure to know all of them. But yeah, Goodyear is one that we know, and they're in the process, I believe, of getting ready to start up again.
Okay.
I know that there were some people called back, and I don't know exactly when their full plant operation will begin, but we'll find out and kind of start getting some predictors from people as to when operations are going to go back. Good news is most of our food producers stayed in operation during this time frame, so the use of water there stayed constant.
Great, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So we'll keep moving into the other utilities. Is that okay?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Okay, so looking at, in all three scenarios, the low impact assumes a 2% revenue decline, a moderate is 5%, and then a high impact is 10. So that's the same for all three of the individual utility funds. Looking at water, and I think, again, this is just giving you insight into the potential options that the managers over at utility could implement in the event we saw an ongoing revenue decline. And so you'll see that they've looked into holding vacancies open, reduction in temp labor, and then, the more low-hanging fruit in terms of conferences and travel, and then building improvements and that cash transfer to the CIP program and the two more severe scenarios. The water, all the funds are budgeted a little bit differently than the general fund. They're budgeted knowing or targeting a surplus so that money can go back into the system. And so I will share, when I first was going through these with Nicole, my first thought was, oh, well, it's okay, we're still gonna have a surplus. And then had to walk myself back through the whole purpose of the original adopted budget containing a surplus, right? We want to be able to utilize all the tools in our toolbox, which includes bonding for projects, but it also includes implementing cash projects as well. So I just want to point that out if anybody else had the same initial response as I did. In water, even in the high impact scenario, they would maintain the 175 days cash on hand. So if we started to see that larger 10% revenue decline, we would have to look at the overall operations as well. But they've definitely laid out some good options to address a declining revenue situation. Questions on water?
Councilman Duncan.
Really, just out of curiosity, if you, page 21, you look at the elimination of cash transfer for CIP, we have $1 million transfer if it's moderate or high impact. I'm just curious what the thought was of not including that in the low impact scenario.
In the low impact scenario, we would be able to transfer the capital money over to the CIP. in the moderate and high impact scenario, we would be unable to do that. So I apologize if it's unclear. Under that expenditure reduction, that's the list of items that we would pull back on and not spend on in the event we had to, adjust the budget. So maybe that should be a negative number, but it's in the moderate and high impact scenario, we wouldn't transfer money to the CIP.
Councilwoman Nager?
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Another question about the difference between different impact levels. For the hold vacancies, low and moderate are the same, and high is twice as much for the hold vacancies. Why is that?
I think throughout the year, we were trying to make sure in our assumptions that if we didn't see as significant of a decline, that we would still be trying to work towards as normal operations as possible. In the high impact scenario, you would have to hold more positions open.
Thank you.
Additional questions? Seeing none, Ms. Lamandola, you may proceed.
Okay. So we'll move on to stormwater. Similar scenarios. Again, at this point, we don't have a good deal of information to understand the impact of the moratorium and then what the activity would be from increased economic activity starting, June, July. So it was the 2%, 10%, 2%, 5%, and 10% declines. They have a little bit less ability to maneuver their budget. It's a smaller department. The vacancies being held open at this point in terms of the current vacancies would only be about 23,800. But they would be able to reduce their fleet replacement program in that high impact scenario.
Okay.
Councilwoman Hiller?
Thank you, Mayor. Water and wastewater are both based on usage, but stormwater fees are based on your square footage of impermeable surface, which would not change at all. And so is this deduction just because you think that people won't pay?
That's what we were trying to model, depending on regardless of the revenue driver, in a significant economic impact, we would expect that it would decline, regardless of whether it's for usage or just a flat amount.
Okay, because the billings wouldn't change, I would think. Okay, just checking, thank you.
Okay.
Additional questions from the body, those who are on Zoom? Seeing none, you may proceed, Ms. Lamandola.
Okay. So then moving on to wastewater. It's the same stress scenarios that we've assumed, the 2, 5, and 10. Stormwater is a bigger budget than wastewater than stormwater, but it's still not quite as big as the water budget. So you have a little bit fewer options. So if we held vacancies in that high impact scenario, again, we would have to see ongoing significant revenue collection, I think, to really pare down the operations.
Ms. Lamandola, I am
Yes, ma'am.
so sorry to interrupt you. I have a question from Deputy Mayor.
Thank you, Mayor. I'm sure this is just an error in your spreadsheet, but under low impact, you're going to do better than budgeted. Is that correct?
No, yes, it's not, I don't believe it's an error. I think that revenue was trending up.
Heck, okay, I hope we do worse then. Hope we have a low impact. That's great, we're going to make more money. Okay, thank you.
Utilities, I believe they're on, so if, Nicole, Bob, or Braxton, if I am wrong, please jump in here.
Rate increases probably.
Well, water didn't increase.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I could not hear Councilman Everson's question.
Under the low impact, it actually is better than budgeted. She was saying, I think these were 2, 5, and 10% declines, but what's supposed to be a 2% decline from budget is actually better than expected.
Correct, but our projected revenue for wastewater is actually better than budgeted right now. We have some temporary additional income streams that are coming in, which is showing that increase. So we went ahead and took those into account before the 2% reduction, so that it was a true look at what we're projecting this year.
Okay, I'm trying to think of a very careful way to ask this question then, but without using more water, how do you create more wastewater? Or how would the revenue, would it be the gas, the biogas, or?
It is our high-strength waste facility at the wastewater treatment plant, so yes, it does not have anything to do with water consumption.
Fantastic, okay, I just want to make sure that's correct, because that was the first time we've seen a low impact be better than budgeted. Okay, thank you.
So if only all of our funds could perform as wastewater, I think we'd be having a happier. But again, here, if we saw that significant decline in revenue source, they have options that they would be able to address the budget deficit so that we can maintain operations and complete our mission. So with that, if you go back to the combined utilities and just highlighting the days cash on hand, for bond covenants, it's the combination of all of those. So Madam Mayor, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'm happy to answer any questions, but I'll turn it back over to the city manager.
Councilman Lesser.
Yeah, I have a quick question, Jessica. In regards to, I want to make sure that I'm reading that, under the expenses of stormwater, wastewater, utilities, is personnel, are we talking staffing there, I assume?
Yes, that's all the costs associated with personnel.
Was there not consideration if we're seeing that much of a reduction? I noticed that the personnel expenditure stays the same in regards to a 10% decline in revenue. What was the thought process on that?
I mean, the feedback to date that we've received is to hold personnel at current levels, unless it's like an organic vacancy where we're looking for savings.
Thank you.
Okay. Councilman Duncan.
This is, I guess, a question for maybe the city manager, whoever wants to answer it. Could you give us some context in how these have put together by staff? And I guess what I mean by that is, were the parameters basically given to the different departments, these are the areas, or have we given them the opportunity to say to them, we need 2%, 5%, and 10% reductions if this happens. You tell us what those are and the best way you think your department can take those on. And in those cases, there may be some things like whether it's furloughs of personnel or some other issues versus. And so I'm just curious if you could give us some idea of how those have been put together and if we've had that specific input from the different departments.
We haven't given specific target as far as percentages. You know, if you look at the front, a lot of those items that are listed like in the general fund, those were specific things that we said we were going to reduce. And we told them to go and look at their department, and there were 4 specific areas that they were told they would reduce. Office supplies, consumable items, education and dues, and conference and travel. And those were reduced significantly, and they're listed. And then what we did was each department was broke up and said, this is how much you must cut from those 4 line items. And so we gave them a specific target. We did give them the flexibility to be able to determine where they would want to make those cuts. So like, for example, in executive, we kept education and dues, slashed travel down to next to nothing, kept what we needed for office supplies, and consumables, we weren't sure exactly what it was set aside for, so it was axed too. So each department then got to choose in those specific areas. Then, on top of it, Jessica and her team have talked to each department about opportunities that they may have specifically related to savings that they might be able to produce for us for a given year. For example, neighborhood relations had the opportunity that some of their personnel could be covered by grant funds instead of from the general fund. And so we'll be making that change so that their salary is paid out of the grant funds versus the general fund. Now, depending on input that we receive today, that might be another possibility that we would specifically do. I can tell you that if you ask the departments to cut, I would say more than 2%, you're probably looking at, they would have to look at personnel. Based on already having made the areas that you would typically say cut. and they've already done that. So the only place they have to go now is personnel, programs, that type of thing.
Thank you.
And City Manager, I think that, just to echo a little bit on what Councilman Duncan is saying, what I would love to see happen from this situation, and this is just my personal feeling, I'm not speaking for the body on this one, and I try never to, by the way. So it would be wonderful if we were to give, first of all, our employees the opportunity to maximize on what they already know. I mean, what are the retirements that we could be looking at accelerating with employees? What are the departments that we can be restructuring, not just for now, but for the future? But also including our employees and our unions and everybody to have this conversation to talk about how can we maximize what we have today in front of us. I really think that if we go back to our departments and talk to our employees and we talk to our unions, I think that what we're going to see is a desire to collaborate and an understanding once we show them what not just this year is going to look like, but what next year is going to look like. Because I think that it's imperative that we all on this table understand, on these tables, understand that this virus is here to stay. And that today we are going to make some announcements with regards to, following potentially the governor's order, which means that there may be some opening. But I want everybody to understand that we're also, until we have a vaccine, expecting for this virus to be here with us permanently. Therefore, the impacts that we're seeing in our budget today are impacts that we're going to continue seeing probably next year. And the economic impact that we're seeing now is going to be compounded by what's going to happen in the time that it's going to take us to recover. Now, the wonderful thing about this is the fact that we have been able to act early enough, that we're preserving lives, and that we are able to make sure that there's more people to come back to start kickstarting our economy. The challenge that we have is that we have to be very vigilant about what's going to happen in September, when we expect nationally, there is an expectation that we're going to start seeing some leveling of the curve, and then eventually we'll start seeing another spike, and there's going to have to be public safety measures that are going to have to be implemented yet again. And I think that it's time for us to have a really somber conversation with regards to how we can maximize the operations to our city, and taking a look at every single one of these departments, but also giving back that ownership to our employees. Because I think that if we give them the opportunity, they will rise to the occasion. And taking a look at our departments and the way that they're structured right now, I think is a very fair point. Looking at historical values, how did we operate before? When was the point that we were leaner? So it's the time for us to take a look at everything that we can potentially do, not only to set up our city for success today, but how do we set up our city for success for the next few years to come? A great case study for us to look at as a body is Columbia, South Carolina. They saw themselves in a situation of crisis. They even put together a committee that would approve any hire, any kind of very similar to what we did at the end of the year. But they also started looking at each position as a nugget and started working with each department to really take a look at what it would take to save money, still providing good service to our community. And I think that that is the mentality that this crisis has positioned us in. But again, I think that we need to include our team in this. I think that our team will rise up to the occasion. So, Councilman Duncan.
Well, I'll just piggyback off that because you brought it up, and that was one of my things I'm sure we'll get to here. But was, obviously, there's been talks of maybe looking at staff restructuring. But I guess at some point what I'd like to see, and I don't know if this has been done since you've been here, or maybe it hasn't been for a while, I would like to see our departments look at some zero-based budgeting assessments and give us sort of an analysis that way to show us what some of those decisions might shake out. I think that's a model that can be used for that. And I think they give us a little bit better picture of how those departments could operate. So that's a tough conversation, but I think we're there. And I think one of the things I've tried to keep in mind as we make these decisions is everything we do now is significantly connected to the decisions we have to make several months from now on our next budget. I mean, they are directly connected. They're always connected, but they're really connected right now in terms of how those decisions are going to impact that. And so I think we have to start making some of those decisions now.
Councilwoman Hiller.
Oh, I'll piggyback on that as well. I agree. And city manager and I have had a little bit of conversation about this, but sometimes I think the staff has tremendous input, and I really appreciate your comments and suggesting that they be included. Sometimes, though, it's hard to suggest change when it's your colleagues as well, and I think if we can broaden even the challenge to both city manager and to them, for instance, and of course, I've been on for 10 years, so I watched us cut over 100 positions in 2010 when we had the decline before. And it was really hard, but it was necessary. We recovered that many, including the numbers that we didn't have, that we sent over to the Parks and Rec. So somehow, we have added a substantial number of positions. I think looking back in the last 10 years, and looking at what positions we've added to evaluate whether there was a corresponding reduction someplace else or economies, whether we're getting product for that investment. Also, when we began to reinvest in fleet, the idea was we could reduce the amount of service calls because our fleet would be in better shape. I don't know whether that's happened. When we transferred Parks and Rec out, we had a forestry department that was of a certain size, and the idea was when we didn't have to take care of all the trees and mowing in parks anymore, or trees especially, that should reduce the pressure on forestry. Those are just a couple of examples. But just to look back at what that inventory or the census of employees were and what they were and what positions we've added, what changes have occurred, and engaging the staff in that as well certainly might be enlightening, might be a tool to use to look. We wanted economies, but we certainly want people taken care of, those that are working to be busy and to be well taken care of as well. It's tough. Thank you.
I have been asked for a short 5-minute recess. So at this point in time, if everybody's okay with that, we'll have a short recess, and we will reconvene very shortly. Thank you. You're welcome. We are reconvening. I know that Councilwoman Hiller had just summarized her remarks, and I do want to announce that if the meeting goes long, surprise Councilman, Deputy Mayor, part of the perks of this is that you will take this meeting. I have to be at 4 o'clock at the press conference this afternoon. So around 3:30, I may duck out. And knowing that more than likely, it's an empty seat, knowing that more than likely I will have to leave, I will ask for one more thing for consideration as we're talking about the budget. I know that we're talking about how to find efficiencies, and then in addition to that, I do want to propose something for our community, which is, I don't know how we could figure out, as we're looking at departments and everything, a way of ensuring that we have a point person assigned to working with our local business communities. I think that it's going to be imperative that we have some sort of flow of communication in which we are able to understand what those business needs are, so that we can be working jointly both on our response and service delivery, so that we could help our businesses have all of the support that they can possibly have for the city. It's going to be critical that we can help them from our perspective, and I know that there's not much that we can do. I know that we have water rates. I know that we have, other, like the parking funds and other things. But what are things that we could be collaborating with, either looking for grants, helping us advocate at the federal level, I think that the governing body knows. I've been forwarding them emails as we're seeing what the Conference of Mayors is doing so that we can all advocate together for our community and for our businesses. But we need to have some sort of liaison with the Greater Topeka Partnership that helps us transition and help us bring our businesses back and support them in any way that we can. City Manager.
I was just curious, when you're referring to that, I'm on the recovery task force that has a portion of that. Are you talking above that or beyond that part of it, which?
Well, we could,
I'm just trying to make sure I
and
understand.
I think that, City Manager, you have the huge task of running the city with all of the other issues. I think that one of the things that we could eventually consider is figuring out how we can have somebody support you, specifically in that, whether it's you or it's just something for us to keep in mind.
I'm just trying to figure out where you're going with it and where the right fit is.
But I think that it's important that our businesses understand that we are going to be ready and prepared to collaborate with them, and that we do have to start having conversations on what their losses were with the partnership and understand how we can all come alongside them. Because if we're really talking about how we're going to have a recovery task force for our community, I think that we really have to take a look at what we could be doing better to just work with our businesses as well. Councilwoman Valdivia Alcala.
Okay, so with what you're saying, thank you, Mayor, with what you're saying is not only helping, but for the gathering of information so that we can see as a council how bad the economic picture is in Topeka specifically. So as much in the way of hard numbers, as much in the way of what they were able to, I mean, what was required in the way of layoffs, all of that, so we can see how bad the economic damage is.
Yes, ma'am.
Correct?
Absolutely.
I agree, because it does feel like in District 2, getting hold of a number of businesses, small businesses, and to see, you know, have they tapped into the host program? Have they tapped into that 1 million? I don't know how much is left of that funding that was put over from JADO. And it's very fragmented, even in, you know, in District 2. Some people have, some people still don't know about it yet, but I think the sooner, and we don't want to rush it to where it's going to be incomplete or maybe exaggerated or underreported information, so that we can have a look at that in a number of pages. Because it feels like it's all over the place and none of us really have a handle on it. And it's because we're still in it. I understand, but I agree.
Thank you. Councilwoman Hiller?
We might be able to, I'm trying to actively listen here, to inventory who's already involved. I mean, you're on the Greater Topeka Partnerships Executive Board, as are you, and maybe Councilman Padilla as well, if I'm not mistaken. And then we have people on the Go Topeka Board. I've been working really actively, just boots on the ground regarding trying to help out with the host and the JADO program that we did. And it might be that rather than adding anybody to it, it would be helpful first to inventory who's plugged in where, and similar for the businesses. And then similarly, we may not be as well represented on the emergency aid providers and the United Way agencies and so on, in terms of lots of good things are happening there too, in terms of rallying support and services. So I think that sector has mobilized as well, but if we're wanting to keep posted, I'm thinking about that end as well. But if we already have one or two people on each of the key task forces, maybe we just need to all know who they are and refresh on that.
And again, I'm not dictating a specific position or person. I'm saying that it's something that we as a body and city manager as well, we're going to really have to take a look into.
Right.
So, sorry. Councilman Lesser, thank you for your patience.
Sure. The only other thing I will say that I will walk very smoothly on this because it is a little bit of a political statement. But I think also, though, as a capital city, I think we have to, the governor has came up with what her orders are. We'll see what that is, or what Shawnee County, exactly what those come out today. But I think as a capital city of Kansas, I think we have to pay close attention to the data that comes in. And I think we really have to take a leadership role in at some point verbalizing what the risk reward is for our capital city, for businesses and for health, and look at that, because that balance is something that there's varying thoughts on where that balance is at for Topeka, Kansas versus New York City versus other parts of the country. I'm in no way in shape trying to minimize, because this is tragic. But I also say I think we need to keep our eyes open, our ears open, and understand where we're at, and try to find lead with balance where that is, and if need be, question decisions that are made. And that's just my opinion. Thank you.
Additional comments or questions? Councilman Duncan?
Not to that. Where are we at in the, I have other random
Oh,
thoughts.
budget? No, this is.
I don't want to jump ahead of anybody or usurp the.
Go on the budget, and then followed by Councilwoman Valdivia Alcala.
And I just had a couple things that didn't sort of naturally come up. First is, have we had any opportunity to look at, with interest rates changing now, is there any of our $30 million plus in debt that we can refinance at this point? Are we looking at that? Have we pursued any of those options? Any hope?
Our financial advisor is doing that all the time. And so I think if there are opportunities to do that, we'll find them. And typically, we're doing that as a lead-up to our next issuance to save money. Each time you go through an issuance, there's a cost to have the attorneys and those folks do it. So we usually do it as a group. With the projections that we have regarding rates, where they're going to be, and Jessica can obviously answer this much better than me with her past, we'll be analyzing and looking at opportunities, and I think you're probably likely going to find some. Jessica, you want to add what you think we're going to see as far as refunding opportunities, please?
Well, with our maturity amortization schedule, it's on the shorter end, how we typically issue. So we will be looking for those cost savings in terms of refinancing, and our financial advisor is constantly reevaluating the market. It'll depend on whether we've already issued at historically low interest rates. My understanding, so I'm on the GFOA's National Debt Committee, and I'm also on a Fed joint committee with the GFOA and then also the state treasurers. And so through that committee, I've heard a lot of discussion about advanced refunding potentially being discussed, or BQ debt, some of the other different types of issuance. And so in the event like advanced refunding came back, we'd probably potentially have some more opportunity there. But it's a really good question. It's one of those areas when it pops up, you can quickly receive savings within your regular operating budget. So we'll keep you updated, but our financial advisor does a pretty good job of making us aware of potential opportunities.
Two more short things. Like all my good ideas, I found out today one of them was thwarted by state law. But because one of the things I looked at is we obviously have some people who are probably close, maybe 2 years or so from retirement. They have their points, but they're not quite there. So I had this great idea if there was opportunities to basically buy those people out, but ensure that they completely could vest in their capers. After a long conversation, very enlightening with capers, that's precluded by state law. One of the things I will pursue with staff later is changing that state law, because there's some in capers who think it could be changed, which would help us in a year if we could get it changed next year in the 2021 budget year. if there are some of those opportunities. But the reason I bring that up is to say that that may be an avenue we can look at in the next year of seeing if we can help municipalities in that area. But and this is just ignorance on my part, are all city employees is that the only retirement we assist with, pay, offer? I mean, it's either that or
It's
nothing.
CAPERS or KP&F.
Okay.
And those are the only two. Now, employees have the option to voluntarily add their own money into a 457 plan.
Sure.
That we have a couple of options for them, either through CAPERS or through ICMARC or one of those types of operations. But the only ones that they're authorized where we put money into is CAPERS or KP&F.
Okay. And then I don't know if there are any early retirement opportunities out there, but I'm sure staff is looking at that. My last thing is, well, two more things. One's really short. I'll just echo what the mayor said earlier about, the low-hanging fruit right now is there's no reason that we should be purchasing vehicles for the next 6 months. There's no reason that we should be purchasing any equipment unless it's truly necessary for public safety or other, and as tough as that may be, if that means we have to share some copy machines or a truck across departments, I think we're there. I was curious, and same with travel. I know the comment was made some departments haven't been able to totally get to the travel number. I'm not sure what the reason is. I would think at this point, unless it's for accreditation, true accreditation, or we have to qualify for a grant program and you have to be there in person, I don't know why any of us need to go anywhere, for the next 6 months. My last thing is, here's what I don't see in this budget. I don't see a line item, and this is an expense, sorry, but I don't see anything that has us future purchases for additional PPE and other such equipment. Are we looking at purchasing sanitization equipment for those machines? I know the state just purchased one. I think we can get some share time with that, maybe. But that's an expense, but it seems to me like something we should be looking at. I don't think our city employees should have to bring their own masks to work for the next 6 months. And I'm not saying they are, and I would think our police and fire specifically would like to have some of those equipments that are sanitizing things for reuse. So I'm just curious if we've looked at that, what it will cost us moving forward, and if that needs to be built into some of these projections.
I can answer that. As far as the sanitation for N95 masks, that type of thing, the equipment that was purchased that is housed here in Topeka, we have access to that, and we're currently collecting N95 masks when shifts are done for firemen and so forth. And so then that's collected and will be taken to that facility. So that's started. As far as masks, we are in the process of purchasing cloth masks for all employees so that when we're in environments where we're close to work, obviously if you can do social distancing, you're not required to wear one, but when we have environments where that's the case, everyone will have a mask so they can wear it. And so that will be available. We're starting with making sure that everybody has one if they don't have their own, and then working towards two so that they can then. And we found a local vendor that's producing those for us, and so we're in the process of issuing those out to individuals. But the other PPE is something that we just recently, today, Jim Green put an order in related to additional PPE that different departments may need. As we go through this right now, 75% of it's covered by FEMA and 25% by us. And so we're working through the line item that relates to that as a general line item related to PPE purchase.
Thank you.
Okay, Councilwoman Valdivia Alcala.
Thank you, Mayor. Several things I wanted to bring up, and I just wanted to highlight that today is International Worker Day. So thank you for all the hardworking City of Topeka employees that I'm sure are struggling in so many ways and have a lot of anxiety during this time. First and foremost, I think that what this makes me realize is that we need to make sure that wage cuts, furloughs, layoffs, whatever the case may be, in my opinion, should be the last resort for workers that make Topeka run. And of course, that comes with public health and safety. I know that there had been the mandate that had gone down to the fire department that there was not to be any overtime. In our district, that has caused Station 1 in the last 10 days or so, 10 to 12 days, to be shut down 5 different times. There was a shooting in the area that because it was closed, there was, obviously no one to respond from Station 1, and a fire in that area of North Topeka. So Already, we are starting to see, again, what I believe are reactive, as I stated in the last city council meeting, these are reactive moves that are not a benefit to the citizens of Topeka and not benefit to our public safety workers. And so coming from the area of District 2, I believe that we deserve the same quality of and the same type of public health and safety care as any other part of the city does. And I think that also we have to remember that there are 8 unions that are brought forth some very affirming possibilities to look at, some which I agree with, and also a willingness to negotiate and sit down and talk and work this out. Again, what we looked at was a reactive move. We have got to move away from reactive and start looking at deliberate, start looking at, okay, you know, let's see what we can do to make our departments as efficient as possible. But again, not in a way that does not include the worker in these negotiations. You know, they've been talking about things like postponement of CIF projects. I mean, is there anything that we can postpone? I was talking to a couple of firefighters. They were saying at one of their stations there was renovations that were supposed to be done this year. I have to look that up, obviously, and get more information on that. But what kind of cost savings might be a benefit to postpone that for now? Not everything needs to be done now if it's going to furlough people, if it's going to cost people to have to suffer through less on their checks. Also, retirement incentives. I think, you know, Spencer mentioned that before. I know that we talked a little bit about vacancy credits. Also with retirement and leave credits. So, and I think, I don't want to use this as a go-to right off the bat, but we know that we have reserves. What is our discussion going to be on the reserves? How far do we believe that we can take that down until we can get more thorough information from this body and from staff and from the union representatives on cuts that can be made and utilizing some of those reserves? I understand that we have to be careful with how much we use, but we have to, in my belief, we have to bring that up as an option if it is going to save jobs with these workers that need these paychecks and their families that are depending on it. So, thank you.
Thank you, Councilwoman. Councilman Dobler.
Thank you, Mayor. I want to highlight 3 things that I've kind of jotted down as we've talked. I mean, it seems to me that the real issue here is the general fund. I understand the utilities are going to face some hardships, but being a separate fund and their purpose, the utilities' purpose is fairly singular. In other words, water revenue goes to pay for water expenses. On the other hand, the general fund has different sources of revenue and a lot of different programs that it funds. I think it's important at this point to prioritize the general fund programs, figure out what are the most important ones, what are the ones we need to continue to fund at 100% or whatever it is. What can we do without? I mean, this is a period in our history where we've got to look at the things that we don't need, the things that have been nice, but we can do without. Not saying there are any, but I'm sure every program has something it can do without at this point. Second thing is I think we need to look at particularly management staffing right now. You know, are all positions necessary? Is there areas where we can consolidate? Are there departments we can consolidate? Definitely something we need to look at. And the final thing is outsourcing and privatization. Are there areas that we can outsource and achieve a savings? Are there areas that we need to look at in terms of privatization? Not saying any of those things are good right now, but we definitely need to look at them and take them into consideration. That's all I've got. Thank you.
City Manager, I have to leave, but I wanted to make sure that I addressed one of the comments that Councilwoman Valdivia Alcala made. I agree that we have reserves, and reserves are there for such a time as this, but also the thing that I want to make sure that we all keep in mind when we are going to tackle and talk about our reserve is that we have to be very cognizant that us really dipping too much into the reserve may be a problem that could cause us to have future projects that are going to be put on our community become extremely expensive when we have been able to enjoy low inflation amounts because of the way that we've managed our budget. However, I do know that our total amount of reserves is over our target, which is the 15%. And I know that the reason that we've been able to have the rates that we do is because we are above that target. So if you only subtract a 6%, 3% for this year, and 3% for next year, with regards to the amounts that we have in our reserve, that is still a healthy amount of money that would then be able to go into our general fund per year, and we have a strategy that would still leave us with some money in there, and still just a little bit. I think it leaves us with a 16%. That it gives us our target number of reserves so that we can still follow through with all of the requirements, but it gives us also an additional slush so that we're able to as well, have a little excess. So that's just my comment as I walk out. I know that you all are going to discuss that. Nobody likes to touch the reserves. I don't like to touch the reserves. But I think that this is not a regular situation in which we can just come back. If we can do as much cuts without touching staff significantly, without touching that reserve, that's one thing. But I think that we should absolutely, like Councilwoman Valdivia is saying, make use of our reserve at this time. Let's just make sure that we're cautious about it. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Mayor. Yes, Councilman Lesser.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. I just had a couple things I wanted to point out as well. One thing I want to say too is at this time it kind of brings me back to a commercial that I remember seeing for that Governor Graves when he was running for mayor, and it was, my dad taught me how to stack them high and tight. Yes, and I think that's kind of the philosophy. I think that I'm trying to take the approach is none of this is to be critical. It's to look at a time taking advantage of looking how we stack everything high and tight. And that being said, I kind of want to piggyback a little bit about what Commissioner Dobler said in regards to looking at all these avenues and Commissioner.
Man, I got raised.
Councilman Dobler said, and these are just things, some of the diligence I've done over the past week. And I recognize, staffing I too as a last resort. Unfortunately, we are also in the same situation that many of our private companies are in that have looked at what they can do, and then the last resort being staffing. But I'd like for us to look at. I got some information in regards to fleet services, and in regards to some of the internal practices we do, such as our internal charge for an oil change check 5,000 miles is $100.20. That is something that I would want us to take a look at seeing if that's an area that we can look at privatization with our local private companies. Another one is a question that I had is a question and a comment, but another thing is with our health clinic and what have you, do we have the capacity to do physicals, new recruit physicals? For instance, in looking at our new recruit physicals for the police department, that's one thing we're contracting out, just the opposite, that we're paying $364 per physical, is height, weight, those type, those basic physicals. Is that something that can be done within our own health clinic, to do that, to get that to a more reasonable cost? And if it's not something, then the question then becomes, why can't we, do that? Those are just a couple of the specifics, that I've looked at. I won't go into all the breaking those two areas down, because there's other areas in that would have discussion with. And then, the one thing that a need versus a want is through this whole process, I've seen, and learned, how the county health department, how they take the lead in this situation would be an evaluation of expenditure versus return for our emergency management department versus utilizing the county and their department for that. So I'm not at this point saying these are things that I want changed. I'm saying I think these are things that warrant analyzation of if there's another way of doing business for these type of things. Thank you.
I can tell you on the health clinic, we're actually in the middle of our RFP review process for the health clinics, and it is something that is an alternative service that we can consider through them. And so we're looking at that, although we did just recently sign our contract within probably the last month with our current provider. So we'll have to look at what we're obligated to under that. But it is something that is an alternative service that we are analyzing right now with our potential new provider, or continuing even with our current provider being able to do that.
Anyone else right now? Any more questions? Yes, Councilwoman Hill.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. I asked a little earlier, but I would ask for an update in terms of what we're looking at in terms of trimming or delaying any of our planned 2020 capital projects.
Yeah, right now staff has already looked and is continuing to look at our sales tax projects primarily. Our other projects, most part, are already covered with their financing and approved. We'll look at, and Jessica's been talking with each department to look at what potential general fund purchases, but we make very few general fund purchases with capital purchases with our general fund. If we do, we typically do it at the end of the year, if money is available. So any capital purchase project that we've been looking at, it may not occur until later in the year. So only if money is available, and in this case, it may not be available the way we're, with the situation that we're in. But we are looking at, engineering, public works are looking at what projects they may need to delay, and they're looking at a couple of month delay just to make sure things are going to be good with regards to revenue. Not so much for this year. There is some float within that fund, and so they can look at probably accomplishing, but it might impact more or less what happens in 21.
Well, I ask that because certainly you've heard me before talk about trimming them if we're doing things that maybe aren't necessary no matter what, and this makes it a good time to look back at that. Other than that, sort of echoing what the mayor said earlier, I'm hopeful that we do roll out all the projects that we were expecting to, because that that helps the economy in terms of the businesses that we're counting on that work, so that people in Shawnee County overall are back to work. So
Correct.
I was hoping that we wouldn't, especially
goal.
with sales tax projects, because we have had a balance in that fund, and so unless it was obligated in ways that we can't see in the quarterly reports, that seemed like an area we could actually contribute with, so.
Jason, are you still on? I'm not sure if Jason.
Yes, the manager's still here.
Okay. Jason, you want to cover real quick where you're at as you guys are analyzing that process regarding projects, at least from your side?
We're still moving forward with the GO bond projects that are scheduled for this year. As you indicated, the Fix Our Streets sales tax projects, we've got a number of those that are out for bid, and bid prices have been favorable. We have some mill and overlay projects that we have ready to go, and we'll kind of sit back and see as the sales tax numbers come and let those middle of summer. And that's just kind of our strategy. But right now, we're still planning to do all the CIP projects that had authorization for this year.
Thank you.
If I could just a follow-up question while Dr. Peak, while you're on. Right now, as you know, oil prices are a huge component of asphalt bids. What are we seeing right now? Are we going to try to take advantage, maybe let some of those earlier, just mill and overlay projects, for instance? Right now, I bet you can get another 50% done for the same amount of money you could last year at this time.
Yes, Deputy Mayor, we have pushed out a number of those mill and overlay projects. So the ones that we're sitting on are smaller projects that are wrapping up design. And we could go ahead and push those out, but we're just being a little conservative there. That's not a significant amount. It's, I believe, just under 2 million of the 19 that we'll be spending out of the sales tax program this year.
Okay, thank you.
I also had a question that I've gotten a couple of contacts on, and that is whether I know it's small compared to this big stuff, but whether we're tracking predictions on transient guest tax revenue.
We haven't delved into that yet. We wanted to make sure that we were ready for this.
I appreciate that.
That question is on my desk.
Okay.
And I just didn't want to have Jessica have any more heart attacks with regards to what there's to be done.
It's fine,
We'll
but
address that in the next week or two.
Probably others besides me, and
Yes.
I thought, oh, that's a good
No, it is
question I
something
should
that I've
ask.
been approached on, but I have not followed up just because we needed to complete this part first.
One last question, if I could. Related to the union's offer to continue to help us work on these issues, did anybody ever run numbers in terms of what the potential of a 3% cut on a typical wage would be compared to the federal money that was coming in and the health holidays that were being proposed, in terms of whether people would be breaking even or ahead or things like that?
There are so many variables that we did not. We know
Okay.
what, the benefits could be if you, and it's different. So in a health holiday case, if you have a family and you pay the full family rate, your savings is, very, very large. But if you have a single, it's not as much. And so
I understand that.
then you take a look at their own, what's the spouse and what the income level is there, what you qualify for through the stimulus check if you were to be laid off, and those types of things. So we didn't run specific case scenarios for individuals just because there were so many variables.
I just wondered if a grid had been done, because it was raised to me that maybe people would actually do okay, and I hadn't thought about that.
It's possible. I mean, with the extra $600 you'd receive if you were laid off, you might, but it also depends on what your salary level is you go into that.
Sure.
As to
Just-
whether or not it makes more sense.
Just checking. Thank you.
There is a break point there. I don't remember what it was.
Well, and if the combined income was over 100,000, that makes a difference on eligibility for the
Right.
federal, right?
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
I guess, City Manager, just to, that actually leads to a question that I had. Councilman Ortiz, I'll see you here in 1 second. I see you there. I will get you in one second. But on the health holiday, there's 1.2 million shown in our, is that 1 month? Is that 2 months?
That's
Is it?
2 different months. Per the agreement that we have right now, we can do the 1 month, the 2 different pay periods in the last quarter, the December month. If we want to do more, we must have their approval.
Approval of whom?
Of the unions.
Now, the health holiday, is that just the city saving money? In other words, the city's not putting in their portion? Or is it also the employees not putting in
The
their
employees
portion?
save money as well, yes. The question would be, and part of the reason they must seek approval, is they have the authority to look, or we look at whether or not there is concern regarding the viability of the fund going forward if it were to be granted the additional health holiday. And so we're waiting for a response back from them related to, we presented the information, our review shows that we could do it and not jeopardize the fund to do 4 health holidays, which is an equivalent of 2 months and you sit in on the meeting, Councilwoman, so we've asked them to review and respond, and so we're waiting for that response from the unions, but it's an integral part of, it's a $600,000 amount. If for some reason they were not to approve that, that's $600,000 of our non-personnel savings that we're looking at.
But right now, that you can do the 1.2, you just can't do more than that, or you can't even do the 1.2?
We can do 600,000.
Okay.
If we have to have approval for the other 600,000.
Okay, I'll get to you next, but Councilman, or unless
it's related.
We were gonna find out.
When?
When?
I don't remember. Jackie, what date were you asking them to respond by?
Sorry, I was on mute. They have until next Friday at the close of business to provide a response.
Okay, thank you.
Councilmember Ortiz, thank you for waiting so patiently. Please go ahead.
You're muted.
You're unmuted. You're unmuted. No, now you're mic. You turned into mic on us. 1 second, please. I think you're still muted.
There we go.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Couple of things I wanted to mention. DCF is taking applications for utilities, heating and gas. So I wanted to encourage the residents and let everybody know that. This is not from the previous winter, this is from right now. So I would encourage people that have lost their jobs to get their application in. Also, is there any water funds that we have to tap into for the residents that are struggling?
We do have some funds. Nicole, can you tell us where we're at with our funding for that?
Yes, we have our utility rate refund program that is always available. I believe that at last check, it was probably about 40% expended at this point, but there was still 60% available for residents. And as always, we have the water share program, which is funded by donations from the community, and that's available for anybody who's having an acute need to get their water bill paid.
Okay, thank you. And then my next question, or my next comment would be, I did hear Jason Peak say we're going to spend $2 million of the street sales tax funds. I think it's very, very important that we communicate with everyone that these funds cannot be used for employees for their pay. I think that's very important because people are going to see us out there fixing the streets and they're going to say they're laying off workers, they're asking them for cuts, and they don't understand that there's certain monies that we can spend only on certain things. And I think that's very, very important that we let them know that, as well as just when we do projects, some of that's bonded, so we can't use that money on employees' wages. So I think that's just very important that we continue to educate them and we continue to communicate that with them so much that we're just sick of it because people don't understand that. There's a legal obligation, there's legal pots that money's in, and it has to be spent that way. Thank you, Deputy Mayor.
You're welcome. Great point, Councilwoman. Anyone else? Any further questions? Thoughts? Oh,
Yeah.
oh, well, yes, sorry, I have to look up to the monitor. Councilman Padilla, please go ahead. Unmute, please. You were muted, Mike.
Gotcha.
Gotcha, okay.
And thank you, Deputy Mayor. I just want to follow up on what Councilwoman Ortiz just said. And I think that that's very important that we have a clear message, not just for our city employees, but for the community as a whole, who really don't have the information to make that a correct assessment that we have funds that, well, we just take it from here and use it for this, but we're not able to do that. And so if they don't understand it, then it seems like we're not being really judicious in how we're utilizing our money or being efficient in that. So I echo what she says on that. I would like to go back to a little bit about what Councilman Dobler spoke to about the general fund. I think there have been a lot of good suggestions so far. I like the presentation. I'm encouraged that there is more a collaborative effort by the unions to visit and talk. But I too believe that, or at least I strongly believe, this is an opportunity for us to look at our organization as a whole and consider whether or not we have staffing at levels that are traditional rather than necessary. And I think that's important to think about. I know that's kind of unnerving, but I think many organizations have to look to that on a regular basis, because if it needs to get done and we have adequate staff and personnel in place, then that's great. But if we have some that are being underutilized or that we need to reorganize, I think this is our opportunity to show a real effort to try and be as efficient organization as possible. And I think that starts from top down, not bottom up. So I would encourage city manager and the rest of his staff. I know that we didn't talk a lot about that in the presentation, but I think that's something that we still have to be aware of, that if we get to that point, that we've given some real thought to how we are staffing our organization. And I thank them for all the work that they've done so far. I know that they're putting in long hours, and I appreciate all that effort. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilman Padilla. Anyone else, questions or comments? Yeah, Councilman Dobler, please.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Mayor. Yeah, I'd just like to thank particularly Jessica and her staff. I know they put a lot of work into this. It was very clear. I do a lot of spreadsheets and see a lot of spreadsheets, and most of them I don't understand, but I was able to follow this very well. So I appreciate that. I appreciate the time, effort, and the clarity with which it was presented. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, and I'd echo those comments as well. Mr. Trout, I guess my question would be, is there a roadmap going forward here of how we're going to proceed? I mean, we're kind of to the end of today, it sounds like. We have the information now.
Well, this feedback is vital for me as I go forward. The next steps for me will be to go back and review the notes that I've taken here, talk with staff on their ideas that they have, what we've explored. We're looking to try and set up a meeting with the union within the next week or so to go through the items that they brought. Some of them we already have. Some of the items they brought are already included in this, and so it's really just making sure they understand we've already included, here's where it is. So there's not something additional that could be done to avoid that. Have discussions on some of the items to make sure we clearly understand what they are, then we'll evaluate that. My intent is that each of the meetings, that the first and third meetings, is to talk about what we're doing with relation to this and make changes as we identify things that make sense, bring them forward to let you know what we're looking at for those changes.
Okay. Fantastic, thank you. Councilwoman Hiller.
Thank you. One last time. I too, I think Jessica, she's up there somewhere, I sent her a note to. I think the document as well as the presentation were stellar. They were complete, they were easy to read, complete especially for the things that were on deck. And that's really helpful. I wanted to refresh, though, that you may want to change the bottom line on there just for us. Jessica verbally told us at the beginning of the presentation that we in fact have 1.2 million less in our bottom line available than appears. And so that means that even that with these projections, we would make a substantial hit on our reserve balance in the low impact, but we would be under our cap even at the medium impact. And so it's a challenge to all of us, as Councilwoman Valdivia Alcala said as well, to see, particularly looking forward to next year, how far we think it's safe to go this year, so that when we have those updates in a week and in 3 weeks, we as a body with the city manager need to get a comfort level, if we can, to arrive at what a break number is. And if we're comfortable with the ones that are there at that lower level, okay, but if we're not, we need to communicate that jointly, or at least to the city manager.
Thank you.
Councilwoman?
Councilwoman Valdivia Alcala? I'm sorry, I'm sorry, Jessica, if you were trying to answer that, go ahead.
Okay, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but I just wanted to clarify the 20.29 million is the projected year in 2019. So when we get the CAFR in a few weeks, that number shouldn't go down by another 1.3 million.
That's the number.
Councilwoman Valdivia Alcala?
It was 21 point something.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. You know, I definitely agree, there has to be a cap. We can't take it down too low where we are going to then take it down so low that we end up regretting it. Just refresh my memory, though, is there currently an ordinance about the percentage that it cannot go below? Is that 15?
Current fund balance policy says that it can't go below 15%.
Well, that's our target. It doesn't say it can't below it.
Well, that's our target, the 15%.
The minimum is 15. The target is 20. Sorry.
The minimum is 15, and that's not set in stone anywhere. I'm just asking because we've got to talk about it sometime down the road, so.
Right.
Okay, so it's not set. Okay, and also, as I continue to learn how to read budgets, thank you, Jessica, for all of the hard work. And I would also agree with the sentiments I'm hearing in that, as I stated before, streamlining is important. The most efficient that we can is important, and as Councilman Padilla said, the top-down approach is what I agree with that we should be looking at when we look at staffing. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilman Lesser?
Just a follow-up, City Manager. Have we received anything, I know you had reached out for a comparative analysis from Freddie and the GTP. Yes. Have we received that, or are we waiting on that?
His first cut was given to us, which was a 6 to 11% projection, but him and Jessica exchanged some information, and he is going back and reviewing it with more years of data to be able to look at what his projection would be. The first projection was not, I guess, thorough enough with the data sets that were available. And so Jessica provided that information. It's in our CAFR. And so that information was provided to him, and he is in the middle of doing a further review. And we're also, I mean, that's part of what we're doing too, is looking at what the state said for their projections for revenue. There's many opportunities, but Freddie's looking at that with more information, and will be getting back to us.
Thank you.
Councilwoman Nager?
I just want to express, thank you, Deputy Mayor. I also wanted to express my deep appreciation and gratitude for the work that the staff has already been doing. With all of the requests coming from us and all the requests coming from citizens, I know that this has been a really, really hard time, and that we are really operating on that currency of trust that we have with the citizens. And you can see that that's different in different areas. And I really appreciate the trust that citizens have lent to us in this past month, 6 weeks. I just want to remind us that we need to lead with pragmatism and creativity, but we also need to be practicing compassion. These are people's livelihoods. These are people's families that we are talking about whenever we're talking about these numbers. So just really fleshing that out. And just a plea to the citizens, as we're doing this work, please do what you can to make sure that we're keeping this to a low to medium impact instead of a high impact. So take care of yourselves, take care of your families, and if you have the means, take care of the people around you and the businesses around you. Thank you.
You're welcome. Well said. Anyone else? All right. Well, I believe there are no other items in front of us. Is that correct? Okay. Well, with that then, thank you everyone for coming out this afternoon. And for those of you online, thank you. And I appreciate the city staff monitoring this to be ready to answer our questions. So that's it for us. We're adjourned. Good afternoon, everyone.